Okay,
Got
perfect. So
it.
it seems as though this is the very first episode of our Polyglot Nation series, in which we interview people who speak languages that represent an ethnic community within their country, within their country of origin or the country in which they're currently living. And our very first guest is Debora. Debora Bukasa. I'm
Hi.
pronouncing your name correctly, I hope.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Well done.
So, Deborah, perhaps you
Yeah.
can give your introduction to the audience. You know yourself best, so fire away.
Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Deborah, as mentioned. I am a Congolese by origin or by nationality, but I've been living in South Africa for about 17 or 18 years. And I have just started my postgrad diploma in accounting at IAS, and I'm living in the Western Cape. About to start my articles as well. So I'm in a bit of a very funny phase of life because 2 weeks ago I was unemployed, not working, not studying, and now I'm just doing everything all at once. So yeah, adjusting and everything. And I speak, I would say, five and a half languages, if a half is a thing.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely a thing. How you define fluency is that's still a topic of dispute amongst linguists. So those five languages are what, Deborah?
In order of comfort, English, French, Afrikaans, Swahili, and Lingala. With
Fantastic.
English Afrikaans being South African languages and the rest being native to my home country.
Fantastic. Okay. And so then my question is, could you provide us with a certain language learning journey? Explain to us how you became comfortable in all of these languages.
So as I mentioned, I'm from Congo, and my mother tongue, if I can put it that way, would be French. That's
Hmm.
the first language I learned when I was being raised by my parents. That's the language that they taught me. Naturally, the region of Congo that I grew up in, or the province or town that I grew up in, which is Lubumbashi, we would be raised speaking French maybe when you go to school and Swahili at home. But according to my parents, I chose not to learn Swahili. And I don't know why. We moved to South Africa not a few years ago, almost 2 decades ago. And once again, naturally, you're forced to learn the language that you're being taught in, which is English.
Hmm.
And I think English, I honestly do not remember what my English journey was because I was still a child. I started primary school here.
Hmm.
What I have a very good memory of is Afrikaans, and I still remember being thrown with a paper in grade 3, and it was the most basic thing. It was the fat boy rolls the ball or something like that, and I was
Yeah.
like, there goes my academics. I'm never going to pass this. I'm never going to do this. Um, Fortunately enough, the home we were living in at that time, we were completely surrounded by Afrikaans speaking people. And my mom was so brave. Every time I would have homework, she would knock on people's doors and say, well, listen, my child does not understand. Would you help her? And so I was forced to communicate with them in Afrikaans because that is what they thought was most helpful, which is fantastic. And that's one of the biggest things that helped me because when they were helping me, they wouldn't speak to me in English. They would ask me questions in Afrikaans. They would force me to speak Afrikaans at that time. That was the first big thing. The second big thing would have been watching TV shows in Afrikaans. And I don't know if you remember, if you're a South African, you would know Seven Dalan.
I, I
Um,
know Sieverdalon, but for our non-South African audience, Sieverdalon is this. Well, it's no longer ongoing. Actually, the
yeah,
interestingly enough, as about a month ago, since we
yeah,
recorded this
yeah.
video, so we're recording this video in mid to late January
Mm.
2024, and in December 26th, Sieverdalon aired its historic final episode. But Sieverdalon
Bad.
is. Well, are you a Sieverdalon fan?
I don't know. It helped me get through Afrikaans for what, 9 years? So I don't know.
Yes. Well, it's in fact for the non-South Africans, Deborah's story is relatable to many South Africans because Sieverdalon is this quasi soap opera. I say quasi soap opera because the elements of drama are
Mm.
um, are often sort of inferior or in a sense are often uh,
Not really there.
supporting, play a supporting
Yeah.
role to the daily happenings in this particularly
Yeah.
invented suburb, Hillside. And Hillside, again, for non-South Africans is based on a very sort of trendy area in Johannesburg called Melville. Um, now,
Oh,
are you from? Have you spent much time in Joburg, Deborah?
I'm not from Joburg. I'm in the Western Cape, so I'm
Yes.
not familiar with it.
Okay, well, Melville is essentially this very trendy area, not too far from the University of the Witwatersrand, which is one
Okay.
of South Africa's major universities. So anyway, this Afrikaans soap opera would air every weekday from at about 7:30
Mm,
for goodness, close to 25 years, I think. Hey,
yeah,
yeah. I
yeah,
think it
I
was
think so,
something on
yeah.
its 5,000th episode or something like that, and then
Sure.
it was finally cancelled on national broadcasting. But it's very common. This is an Afrikaans language soap opera, and it's very common that South Africans learned a lot of their Afrikaans from that series, and even non-South Africans in the case of Deborah. So um,
Definitely.
yes, and so that's also helped you with your Afrikaans, and we also have, of
Yes.
course, some other languages in your
Yes.
repertoire. Yeah.
Yes, Afrikaans is the third. And then I think I learned Swahili because when we moved to South Africa, I had family that stayed back home. And I think you realize that as your environment changes, your ability to speak a language also changes.
Yeah.
So I became a little less fluent in my French and I struggled to communicate with
Interesting.
family back home. And one of the things I had to do was to adopt Swahili. And I think in a way it came a little easy because it was one of those languages I always heard around me. I just never had the courage to speak a word, to say a single word in it. And I started trying to say a few words. And I remember it was about in my early teens, and my parents would laugh at me because you're pronouncing something wrong or you're what you're saying. We get what you're trying to say, but the way you're pronouncing it sounds like you're saying something completely different, and it's just so funny because it doesn't fit in the context of the sentence you're trying to say. And it's just those crazy little things. But I think I tried for a few more years until I could eventually speak. I still can't write it the way I can write all my other languages, but I definitely can read and I can listen and I can speak way better. Pronunciation is still a struggle, um, but it's better than it was when my parents were laughing at me. I think that language is it's close to home because if I can say it like this, it should be my mother tongue and not French.
Yeah.
It's like, to put it in a South African context, a person is born in a Xhosa family home or in a Zulu family home, raised by Zulu parents, speaking English, but not Zulu, which is the language that
Yeah.
his parents and grandparents would speak, if that makes sense.
Yes. And so Swahili is a very interesting case, right? Because
Yeah,
the fact that you used Swahili almost as a lingua franca, which isn't French, right? And pardon the irony, but the to communicate with your family is of course actually relevant to the history of Swahili because Swahili is a language that grew out of trade in the Indian Ocean. For
yeah,
for the audience who aren't familiar with Swahili, it's actually a it grew out of a really a variety of languages spoken on the eastern coast of South Africa. So proximate to the area where Tanzania is now. Um,
yeah,
and but because it was used to communicate between locals and also Arab traders in the Indian Ocean, it adopted a lot of Arabic vocabulary. I couldn't bring any to mind now. I don't know Swahili well enough, but I don't know. Do you know of any Arabic words in Swahili?
um, I'm not sure if this is a word, but shukran would be, I'm not sure if it is, it basically means thank you, but I think it has its origin from more the Arabic side than the Swahili side. And I just think I should clarify this. When I say Swahili, it's like a very diluted version in Congo, DRC, compared to what
Hmm.
it is in Tanzania and Kenya and other African countries.
Yes.
So I would communicate very well with the Congolese, but I would struggle to speak to anyone that's a little up north or West Africa.
Oh, fascinating. So there's even a lot of variation within Swahili, which makes sense again. It is a language that very much grew out of mercantile interaction. So and in fact, one of the interesting things about Swahili is that it's, in terms of its actual structure, it's part of the Bantu language family. I don't know
Yes.
if I've heard some, I've heard from some that that's not the term that's used anymore in linguistics, but I've also heard from others that it is the term still used in linguistics. But essentially, the Bantu family is a family of languages that dominates in Africa. So it has its origins more or less in Central Africa and spread across most of the continent through a series of migrations that occurred. Goodness, I'm ball putting the number ballpark number. I'm thinking 3,000 years ago, maybe. People in the comments, please correct me where I'm wrong. I'll probably look it up after this and then kick myself for getting the name wrong. But that's actually the family that Swahili belongs to in a sense genealogically.
Mm.
It's a Bantu language by structure, but has imported so many Arabic words that it's a little bit like the case of English, where English is a Germanic language by structure, but has imported so much vocabulary from French and from Latin that it's almost it appears, it looks like a Romance language. So that makes Swahili a particularly interesting language. And as you said, something that I had no idea about is that there are enormous differentiations in between the Swahili that you would speak maybe in Kenya and Tanzania and the Swahili that you grew up around.
Yeah.
Why didn't you? Would you feel confident in speaking a few sentences, a few phrases in Swahili? Because I'm sure our audience probably has heard French and, well, they're hearing English now, but Swahili is something that might be outside of their scope of familiarity.
Yeah. Jambo sana, habari yenu. Mie jina yangu ni Debora, niko hapa na Gregory juu tusumurie mambo ya you see, that's where I get lost. Now I don't know what is language in Swahili. Yeah, yeah. Um, minasikia furaha sana kuya pale.
That's amazing. That's really interesting because as someone who I studied Zulu for a very short time, did not go very
Yeah.
well. But it's very interesting that from even from a completely untrained ear, you can hear that it's got a phonetic
Yeah.
system that's very similar to Zulu, but also there's a very clear Arabic influence as well. So
Yeah.
that was quite nice to hear. Maybe if we get good enough at the editing, we can put some subtitles there, so the audience
Hopefully.
can understand what you said. Okay, so then you've got Swahili. We've spoken about your Afrikaans, your English language journey, your French as well. Lingala. Would you like to say a few words about that to us?
Um, It we have a very divided country when it comes to Lingala and Swahili.
Okay.
And so not divided as in separation, but just divided as in it's so easy to find someone that speaks Lingala but doesn't speak Swahili.
Oh,
Um
interesting. Okay.
whereas uh, it's very hard to go in Congo and find someone that speaks less than two languages.
Yeah.
It's just not a very common thing. So I grew up in South Africa once again, but the largest part of the Congolese community in South Africa, I mean, when you grow up in a diaspora, the first thing you want to do is connect with people from back home.
Precisely.
And the largest part of the Congolese community in South Africa, or at least Cape Town specifically, are Lingala speaking people.
Okay.
And entertainment. So when we say entertainment, I mean music, television, radio, even news in Congo. If it's not in French, it's most likely going to be Lingala. And I think it's one of those things where it's you pick it up as you go because none of my parents are Lingala speakers, but it's so easy to learn because it's everywhere. And it's just one of those languages that you had no choice
Interesting.
because it's just if you wanted to fit in, if you wanted to belong with people from your home country, you had to speak to communicate to them in a language that they understood. I
Yes.
mean, English was obviously an option, but it's not our language. It's
Hmm.
still the language of the land we're living in and not our home language, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think that that ties in very nicely to this next question, which I have is partially about of all these languages, I mean, it's impossible to speak a language without it having a certain degree of meaning to you. Even if you consider that your relationship to a language is purely functional, there are things
Mm.
that like silly things like, your association of Afrikaans with Sieverdelaan, or apparently silly things like like that that actually graft a certain degree of meaning onto language, and our identity is always tied up to some degree in the languages we speak. Um, of all the languages you've spoken, which do you feel is the closest to your heart? Which is the most that you think really manifests who Deborah Bukasa actually is? Or is that a
Um,
trick question? Is it maybe perhaps
no,
the
it's not a
combination of
trick
many?
question. It's not a, I would say it has to be French and Swahili
Okay.
because those are the two that are closest to home for me. Those are the two that my family speaks. Those are the two
Okay.
that I would speak to literally any family member. I struggle to speak one language to people
Yeah.
that speak multiple languages. And so I would easily start something in English, but then head off in Lingala, not Lingala, sorry, in Swahili and then French somewhere there. So I think Swahili and French would be the two that are closest to home. And also because, well, being in a foreign land for 18 years, like it's something that represents home to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's something that connects me with my family back home.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, and you feel as though you can express yourself better in those languages more fluently. Your ideas are maybe a bit more nuanced when you're speaking Swahili and French, as in comparison with English, where perhaps communication comes across slightly more formally. Um, that's certainly the case that I found with languages that I speak. Uh, English comes across as the language in which I'm most comfortable expressing myself in.
Um, no, so I think it's close to home, but I think English would be the language that I'm most comfortable expressing myself. If I had to randomly write a book, or
Okay.
if I had to journalize or write something in my diary or something, it would be in English. So expression, I think just because my vocabulary is wider in English, I have a bigger vocabulary in English, and it's something that I'm more confident in. Whereas my home languages, it's something that's close to home, but I do know that I do struggle with it more than I struggle with English, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And that sort of ties into another question which I have is that is there a specific context? So we know that in family you prefer to speak amongst your family you prefer to speak French and Swahili. But I mean outside of your family, which do each of the languages, what is the situation or the context which you feel most comfortable using English, Afrikaans, and Lingala? Where in which circumstances do you find yourself using those languages most often?
Lingala, I would only speak it if the person I'm speaking to does not understand any of the other languages I can
Okay,
speak.
interesting.
So
Okay,
it's one of those. It's safe in the banks, like I say. It helps me connect with people from my country back home. But you'd never hear me speak it to anyone else unless that person really does not speak any other language that I can speak.
okay,
Mostly
interesting.
because I sound funny when I speak it, but also because it's just not it's not on top of my list of languages in terms of preference, at least. English would be the language that I would most likely introduce myself in, and I would most likely naturally engage in conversations with. Afrikaans, I would use it for comfort. Let's say I walk into a situation where everyone speaks Afrikaans, or not everyone speaks Afrikaans. I studied at Stellenbosch for some context,
Okay,
and so if I walk into a space and people are speaking Afrikaans, the immediate reaction is, oh, hectic. We need to change the language to make the person feel comfortable. And to make them feel comfortable, I would join in the conversation in Afrikaans, if that makes sense.
yes.
Um, yeah, it's more for comfort. And if the person so you would often get South Africans of different cultures or tribes that would not speak English, but they could speak Afrikaans. And so if I'm
Okay.
engaging with them, I would probably speak in Afrikaans with them. Otherwise, yeah.
Cool, cool. And English, of course, I assume that that's been predominantly the languages of your postgraduate studies, right? Um,
Yes.
Certainly the language that you're most exposed to in South African media, I would assume as well.
Yes.
Outside of those contexts, what are the situations in which you'd find yourself speaking English predominantly?
English predominantly. I want to say work, but that's an
Mhm.
obvious.
Yeah, yeah,
Workplaces are all in English, studies are all in English. Maybe with family members that can speak English. Just because, well, with my close family, we mix it all up, whatever
yeah,
comes to mind. If it's French, Swahili, or English, we say whatever. Every now and then, when we're really clueless on what we were trying to say, we might throw in a Lingala word. Um, but yeah, English only comes up with family members who want to speak English only, or with someone who's trying to speak a different language. But with someone who speaks a different language but is trying to learn English. So maybe a family member that came from back home and is visiting and it's like, listen, I don't understand the currency or what the ladies at the shop are saying. So you're only going to speak English to me
yeah.
so that I can speak better with them. So yeah, I think English, I speak it more on a formal level, as in if I'm not working, studying, or doing something like this, I wouldn't be speaking English to someone unless the person I'm speaking to also only understands English,
Yeah, yeah.
or that's
And
the only common language we have.
yeah, and I mean, recognizing the context of this discussion is partially that because we're trying to reach a broad audience of people who speak multiple languages, we
Yeah,
depend on English as kind of our common language. We assume that everyone is
yeah,
more or less going to be comfortable with that, even though actually,
yeah,
probably for a good portion, a substantial portion of the people watching this video, English isn't their first language. I mean, I know in
yes,
my example, English wasn't the first language of any of my grandparents, as far as I can understand. Um, and yet here we are both speaking English. So there's this strong
mm,
power of it as kind of the base common language that you're going
yeah,
to access information and convey information through as well.
yes, yes,
And I think also another interesting thing, I liked what you said there when you were talking about discussions with your family and how sometimes the boundaries between all the different languages you speak break down and you're communicating, let's say you're communicating nominally in French, but there's a lot of Swahili that bleeds in there, maybe a bit of English as well.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I'm sure that's the case with you, and that's the case with lots of with many South Africans who speak multiple languages. You mentioned
yes,
earlier on in the conversation that it's rare to find a Congolese who speaks anything less than two languages, and I think you'd agree with me when I say that that's also representative of South Africa as well, right?
yeah,
South Africa
yes,
is
definitely.
uh, it's I mean officially we have 11 languages, but in any country the official language is not all the languages that are spoken in that country. You know, it doesn't necessarily reflect how many languages are spoken in that country, and that's particularly the case here in South Africa. So that's also that I think is something that's very relevant or that's something that kind of tracks with a lot of what I've seen in South Africa. Um, so I think we're very much reaching towards the end of this discussion. Um, a, an interesting question I have is on a kind of psychological, intellectual, cognitive level, maybe. What is the effect being multilingual has had in your life? Have you seen that's something that's changed the way you approach the world, you perceive the world, in comparison with perhaps your less multilingual peers?
I think I'll use undergrad as an example where you're
Hmm.
exposed to so many different people coming from so many different languages, different countries, sorry, and people's accents or enunciation or pronunciation sounds very different. And being exposed to languages from quite a few different, I would say, families of language
Yeah.
has been very helpful in just being able to understand someone that's not English and how they pronounce their words and how they come across. A simple example is I have quite a few friends that are from Zim, so much love for them, but most of them only speak English as a language. That's their only language. And if we are surrounded by people that can't speak English or for whom English is not their primary language, it's so easy for someone to say something that sounds completely as if it's not a part of the English vocabulary. And just being able to speak different languages has allowed me to understand and communicate better with people. I don't know how helpful this is, but I find myself when I'm speaking to people from different places, my accent changes.
Yes.
Or I don't know, it changes. I would speak English 5 times a day to 5 different people, and if they're all from 5 different cultures or 5 different countries, I would speak it in 5 different accents.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's not something that I consciously do. It just happens. And sometimes I know some people think it's like, oh no, you're looking down on them, or you're not, you think they can't speak English properly. And it's really not about whether I can speak English well or better than the other person. It's just I'm communicating to this person, and my initial reaction or my initial tendencies is always to communicate to them in a way that helps bring the message across best, or in a way that I feel that, oh, I am being understood and they are being understood as well.
yes.
I'm not sure if that makes a lot of sense.
No, it makes a lot of
And
sense. It's a very common phenomenon for us to change the way we speak according
yeah,
to the accents and kind of the dialect of our interlocutors. It's a very
yes,
interesting phenomenon because we do it mostly completely subconsciously, and it's really
yes,
evidence of how good our kind of our pattern recognition skills or how good our ear is.
yeah,
Um, in when it comes to picking up on the subtleties of different dialects. So that is
yeah,
interesting, but it's also something that tracks with experience and a lot of data and a lot of studies that have been
yes.
run on that particular topic. Um, yes, I
So
don't know. Did
that,
I cut you off? I think you had something more to say.
I know, and I think integration into culture, or uh, it helps with the cultural competence, I'd say,
Yes.
because you're exposed to a language that's not yours means being exposed to a culture that you're not a part of, and it really means being forced to learn and engage in ways that helps you best understand the people the culture whose language you're trying to learn. So English is not my first language; it's not my home language. And learning English in South Africa has forced me to adapt to the South African, not forced me, but given me the privilege to adapt to the South African culture better than I would have if
Yeah.
I was not speaking the language. And I think English is still okay because you could easily go to so many other parts of the world and speak English, but something like Afrikaans or something like speaking Swahili, helping me pick up words in Zulu or Sotho, has been extremely helpful in just me adapting to surroundings and just me being able to integrate into any space that I find myself in. And it's a great conversation starter, when they're like, oh, 3 things about myself that you need, when you're trying to break the ice in an
Yeah.
activity, and 3 things about myself, like, oh, I speak 5 languages because it's so easy. It's a great conversation starter.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's always so interesting when you start a conversation and you hear, oh, I speak this language, or I speak this language, or how did you come about? How did learning that language come about? What are your experiences? And it's just it opens you to so much more opportunities because it doesn't limit you to that little community of
Yeah.
your home language, or that little community of, I don't know, that you are part of, but it opens up so much more opportunities for you. And it looks good on your CV.
Yeah. Absolutely. Also, anything CVable is always a plus. Um, yeah, and I think it's I mean that touches into something interesting that I'd like to finish off this message with, which is obviously we speak to a universal or global audience. That's our goal
Yeah,
always. That's our reach. But you and I are both in South Africa, and we know that one of the interesting things is that being around a whole variety of languages that come from various different language families, it really trains your ear. You get a very good
yeah,
feel for what sounds right and what doesn't sound right in a language, and that kind of intuitive um, skill is something that really helps with the language acquisition process. If you even go around formally studying a language, um, you can start to get an idea of what fits and what doesn't, or what's likely to be a word, or what's likely not to be a good translation, purely because you've heard the phonetics of so many different languages um, naturally throughout your life, and you pick up a lot by osmosis. But I think
yeah.
that caps, unless you have something particular that you would like to finish off with, that does cap the first episode of Polyglot Nation, which I'm very
So,
glad we were able to record. I'm very glad that you volunteered your
thanks
time
for the
and
opportunity.
your experience. Well, it's a pleasure. It is a pleasure. We were very grateful for your for you sharing your story. Um, any last words maybe to the viewers? Any recommendations as they go on their own process of language acquisition?
think it would be to step out of your comfort zone. I mean, if you're an English speaker and you're surrounded by English speaking people, you're never going to learn that second language that you're trying to learn.
Yeah,
Step out of your comfort zone, surround yourself with things that helps you to understand the jargons and the dialects of the language that you're trying to learn, or at least the culture that it belongs to. So if you're coming from wherever trying to learn Afrikaans, watch an Afrikaans series, listen to Afrikaans music.
Severland.
Um, yeah, seventh alarm, try and join Afrikaans people activity, like, and learn the differences because you'd speak Afrikaans, but Afrikaans from a Boer and Afrikaans from a Cape Townian is going to sound so different. Afrikaans from someone in Free State, Afrikaans from someone in Durban is going to sound so different. So adapt yourself and learn the differences and have fun while at it. So if you're going to learn Afrikaans, try soaking, try learning, I don't know, early bees music or Snotkop's music, whatever. Have fun while you're at it and be gentle with yourself because for some it does take a while, especially if it's your first time learning a second language, but it gets so much easier by the time you're halfway through.
Awesome. That's great advice. Okay, and on that subject, I'll remind everyone that to please those who are interested join our WhatsApp discussion group. It's growing. It's a large group where you can find. You're highly likely to find anyone who's interested in studying the same language that you're studying or speaking the same language that perhaps you already speak. And with that, I'll say thank you very much, Deborah. And yes, we hope to have you back on the channel soon someday.
Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Oui, dankie. Baie
Au
dankie.
revoir.
Au revoir.